Welcome to part 6 of this Excel VBA user forms tutorial. This part of the series is going to talk about how to use combo boxes, or drop-down lists as they're better known. So we'll start by showing you how to draw and format combo boxes, and then how to populate them using a static list. We'll then write some code that allows you to refer to the selected value and pass that back out into the worksheet. And then we'll move on and show you how you can use dynamic lists and how to add items and clear the list while the form is running. The last part of the video is going to talk about how to use multiple columns and how to reference the values in those multiple columns when the form is running. So quite a lot to do here, let's get started. So to demonstrate how drop-down lists work, we're going to extend our basic data entry form to allow users to select which certificate has been awarded to a film. So you can see that we've already extended our original list on the Sheet 1 worksheet to include a certificate column, and we've already entered some values against the films. Bit of a heavy weighting there for 12A films, but there you go. We've also, just to help ourselves out a little bit later on, created a new lists worksheet in the workbook. And in there we've actually listed out all the available ratings for, well, these are the BBFC ratings, so slightly different to the MPAA if you're in America. So we're going to use these ratings to populate our drop-down list, but before we can do that we of course need to draw it. So we need to go back to the Developer tab and head to the Visual Basic Editor, and with the form open we're going to draw a combo box control on the form. I'd like to add my combo box into the same group of controls as the basic information, so in the same frame. So I don't want to spend too much time doing this, as we've spent an entire video talking about drawing controls already. So I'm just going to rearrange things a little bit by increasing the height of the form, moving my buttons down a little bit. I'm going to increase the height of my frame. Now the combo box tool sits inside the toolbox just next door to the text box, so that's what it looks like. I can click once on that tool and then click once on the form to draw one, just in the same way as drawing any other control. I'm going to give it a sensible name, so I'm going to call this one Film Certificate, and that's the value that it's going to store. Spell certificate properly. Again, there we go, super. Then the next thing I'm going to do is add a label that corresponds to that combo box. So back to the toolbox, I'm going to draw a label which is just next door to it, and I'm going to follow the same sort of naming convention as I follow for all my other pairs of controls and labels. I'm going to call this one Film Certificate Label. So certificate label. This will just make it easier to apply the validation to this control a little bit later on. The caption for my label, I'm just going to enter the value certificate in here. I'm making sure I spell it correctly. There we go. And then a little bit of extra work just to make sure that there's consistency in the layout. I want to make sure that my label height is the same as the height of my previous labels. So I'm going to select a couple of different labels, so the release date and certificate. I want to make sure that release date is the dominant control, and then head to the Format menu and choose Make Same Size Height, so that all matches. What I'm then going to do is make sure that my combo box lines up with all the text boxes. So it looks as though it already does actually, but just to make absolutely certain, I'm going to select all the text boxes. One of them is dominant, the text box at the top. Make sure I've aligned the lefts of those. Then I just want to make sure that the label is aligned to the middle of my combo box. So make sure I've got selected both, make the combo box the dominant control, and then align the middles of those. And there we go, there's our basic combo box drawn on the form. Now it shouldn't be too big a surprise that once you've drawn the combo box it's not actually populated with any values yet. So if I click on the drop down arrow, I'll need to do that a couple of times, there we go, I'll see that the drop down list is empty. So there are several ways to populate a combo box. I'm going to show you the quickest, shortest, simplest using a property called row source. So if I select the combo box, I've got a property in the properties window called row source. The basic idea here is that you enter a string of text which represents a range of cells containing the values you'd like to assign or to populate the combo box with. So I'm going to switch back to Excel just really quickly and show you the range of cells we're going to be using. So this is on a lists worksheet, and I'm going to use cells A2 down to A7. So a simple way to populate that row source property is to enter a string of text referring to that range of cells. So I need to reference it as lists, that's the name of the worksheet, then an exclamation mark to separate the worksheet's name from the range of cells, then simply A2 colon A7. Once I've done that, if I click on the drop down arrow again on the form, I'll find that the list is populated. Now instead of using cell references to set the row source property, you can also use a range name if you've created one. So to create a range name, I'm going to switch back into Excel, and then there are many different ways to do this. You may have seen a few in previous videos that we've made, but one simple way to create a range name is to select the range of cells that you want to give a name to, and then click into the name box at the top left-hand corner of the worksheet, and then simply type in your name. I'm going to call this one BBFC ratings. The important thing is you don't use any spaces in the range name, and also that you press enter once you've finished typing. So that's created a range name that refers to that block of cells. So I'll be able to select that range, and it refers to cells A2 to A7 on the lists sheet. That's just one way to create them. There's many other ways, but that's a quick and simple way. So now that I've created that range name, I can switch back into the Visual Basic editor, and with that combo box still selected, I can head down to the row source property and replace this slightly convoluted reference with BBFC ratings. And that will have exactly the same effect as though I'd referenced the cells by their reference. Personally, I find the range name slightly easier to use, so that's what I tend to do myself, but the choice is yours. The next thing I'd like to do is make sure that when the user clicks the Add to List button, whatever item they've selected from the combo box gets added to the list on the worksheet. So to do that, we need to go to the code behind the click event of the Add to List button. We can do that by double-clicking on it. And then if you remember in the previous video, we refactored this code to make sure we separated out the code that adds the data to the list. So rather than scrolling up and down to find this separate procedure, a simple trick here is to right-click on the procedure's name and then choose Definition, and that'll take you directly to the top of that procedure. Referring to the value of a combo box is pretty much identical to referring to the value of a text box. So we're going to add in a couple of extra lines of code here. I'll separate them out just to make them stand out. And we're going to refer to the value of the cell that's 3 columns to the right of the active cell. That's where the certificate value is going to go. And we're going to change the value of that cell to be equal to filmCertificate.value. So just like a text box, a combo box has got a value property. It's also got a text property as well, just like a text box has. We're going to use the value property. It doesn't really matter which one we choose, but I'm going to use value just to keep things consistent. And then just as we've done with the text box values that we've added in, we're going to apply the same formatting to the new value. So I'm going to refer to the active cell offset 0.3 number format. And then I'm going to make that equal to the number format of the first cell in that column. So that's going to be range E3 dot number format. I'll get my referencing correct. There we go. Range E3 dot number format. Okay, so now that we've added that code, we can simply test out if that works back in Excel. So to test the code, we're going to head back into Excel, and then we'll go to our menu worksheet, and we'll display our form on screen by clicking one of the 3 buttons. And let's add Deadpool again to the list. So we say Deadpool, and the gross was $731 million so far, apparently. Release date was the 12th of Feb 2016, and the certificate. To use this drop-down list, you can of course click on the drop-down arrow with the mouse, no problem. You can also, while the control's got the focus, you can use the keyboard to do it as well. If I hold down the Alt key and press the down arrow key, that expands the list, and then I can scroll up and down the list with the cursor keys. Deadpool was a 15 rated film in the UK, so we're allowed to say naughty words in the film, so there we go. Let's choose 15, and then I can add the film to the list either by clicking my button or using my keyboard shortcut Alt and A. And there we go, Deadpool gets added to the list, and the value of the combo box gets added to the appropriate column as well. So at a basic level, combo boxes are not much more difficult than text boxes, certainly in terms of referencing them in code. They've got this extra feature where you have to populate them with some values, but apart from that, they're pretty straightforward. One small problem with combo boxes by default is that although they look like they've got a restricted list of discrete values to select from, there's nothing to stop you from typing in whatever you want. If I go to the certificate drop-down list, I can type in literally anything, and the text box, the combo box, will accept it. So there's no restriction by default on what you can enter. So that's a problem we need to solve, and we can do that in one of 2 different ways. If I close down the form and then go back to the Visual Basic editor, there are 2 different properties of a combo box that you can change to restrict the user to only those items you've provided in the list. One of the 2 properties you can change has a fairly obvious name. It's called Match Required. So if I scroll down through the properties list and find Match Required, you'll see it's set to false by default. If I double click that, it'll switch to true. And the effect of that, if I switch back into Excel, is that when I show the form and I try to select something that's not in the drop-down list, as soon as I try to move away from that control to set the focus to something else, I'll get this little pop-up message informing me of an invalid property value. Now there's nothing I can do to modify that message that appears as far as I'm aware. That's just a built-in implicit error or warning message. So all I have to do is click OK and then select an item from the list, and then things are fine. Personally, I don't like that style of validation where you have to click on a separate message before you can fix the problem that's been caused. So there's an alternative way you can do this. Rather than using the match required property, if I close the form down and go back to the Visual Basic editor, select the combo box again, and I'll set the match required property back to false. Now, the name of the other property doesn't give you much of a clue that it can control what users can select in the drop-down list. The property's name is called Style. So I scroll down through the Properties window and find the Style property. There it is. We'll find that the default option for a drop-down list is FM Style drop-down combo. I believe the word combo comes from combination of text box and drop-down list. So the idea being that you can select an item from a list or type in a value that you want. Well, we want our drop-down list to behave purely as a drop-down list, not a combination of a text box and a drop-down. So if I select from the style property the only other available option, FM style drop-down list, the effect of that is when I go back to Excel and then attempt to launch my form, if I click into the combo box, I'll find that I can select an item from the list, but I can't just type in whatever I want. If I try typing, nothing will happen. So that's a much better way to validate it. It means I don't have to click OK on a message box. I simply am not allowed to type in any value that I want. So that's the style that I prefer. One other thing I'd like to do in terms of validating the combo box is make sure that a user has selected a value before they add the data to the list. So we can achieve that by making a quick modification to the code we wrote in the previous video to check that all the text boxes have been filled in. If I double click on the Add to List button, the Everything Filled In function, if I just scroll down a little bit, is checking that all of the text boxes have been filled in. So what we're going to do is make a quick modification to the if statement here to make sure that it checks for combo boxes as well. So as well as checking if the type of control is a text box, I'm going to add an OR statement. I'm going to say OR type of CTL is msforms.combobox. What that means I'm going to have to do now is make a couple of other changes. We added in this little bit of extra code in the previous video to store the result of the control, or the control variable, in a variable that can only hold a text box. And that was purely to make the IntelliSense list work, to refer to the value and the back color of the object. Well, I don't want to do that anymore. In fact, I can't do that now. If I'm establishing that this is a combo box, then I can't store a reference to a combo box in a variable that can only hold a reference to a text box. So I'm going to delete that variable altogether, and then revert to using just the CTL variable. So let's take out the line that says set txt equals CTL, and then change this so we refer to the CTL value and the CTL back color. Everything else references the CTL's name, so in that case this will be absolutely fine. So a quick simple little change to incorporate the combo box. The main reason this works, of course, is that the combo box was drawn inside of the film details frame. If I'd drawn it outside of the film details frame, I'd be having to change this loop as well to make sure it loops over all of the controls on the entire form. I could say me.controls, but fortunately we don't have to do that because I drew the combo box inside the frame. So to give this one a quick test, all I should need to do is go back into Excel and then show my form on screen and try to add an item to the list by clicking the button without filling anything in. And you see quite happily that, again, the background colour and the associated label are changed when the combo box hasn't been filled in. If I just select an item here and then try to click the button again, the other thing we haven't done yet is change the background colour and the label colour back to their original ones. So let's just add in a little bit of extra code to achieve that as well. To reset the formatting of the combo box and its label back to their original states, we're going to take the same approach as we did with the text boxes in the previous video. So if we switch back into the Visual Basic editor, we're going to access the after update event of this combo box. If I give that combo box a quick double click, it will give me the default event for the combo box, which is the change event. That's not quite the one that I want. So going to the drop down list at the top right hand corner, I can select any of the other events of that object. So the one I'm going to choose is after update. And then in there I'm just going to write in the code that's going to change the formatting of that object back to its original status. So I'm going to refer to film certificate.backcolor. I'm going to make that equal to RGB white. And then we can refer to the film certificate label, so film certificate label dot forecolor. I'm going to make that equal to the forecolor of the entire form, so me.forecolor is the simplest way to achieve that. And of course I only want to make sure that that works if I have entered a value into the certificate text box, certificate combo box. So I'm going to add a quick if statement around this that's going to say if film certificate dot value is not equal to an empty string. Then change the colors. And then don't forget the end if at the end. Okay, so to give this one final little test in terms of validation, head back to Excel, and then we can show the form on screen again, and if I click Add to List, everything will change colour. If I choose an item from the drop-down list and tab away from this control, then it will revert back to its original colours. So perfect, there's all the validation code working. Just before we move on and talk about a couple of the more sophisticated data properties of the ComboBox, I want to quickly mention one or two of the simple formatting properties. So things you can do to sort of modify the drop-down list style and exactly how the options appear in the list. So there's a property of the ComboBox called drop button style, which you can see by default is set to drop button style arrow. There are a couple of other choices in here. So I can choose button style plain, which removes any symbol from the button altogether. There's ellipsis, which is the ... and there's also the reduce, which is a little underscore icon. They don't do anything to affect what happens when you click on the button. It's purely to do with how that value gets how the button gets displayed. So I think it kind of makes sense to have the drop down arrow style for this particular example. One other thing we can do is change the list style, which affects the display of items inside the list. So there's a list style property here, which is set to plain by default. There's only one other choice in here, it's list style option. So again, it doesn't do anything to affect the way values are selected, but if I click on the drop down arrow now, you can see that each one has a little dot symbol next to it. So it's a sort of a neat way to identify or indicate that each item is being selected. So it's a very quick, simple couple of properties just to show you a couple of simple things you need to modify the appearance of your drop-down lists. Earlier in the video, we used the row source property to set what range of values will be available in the drop-down list. And the property works fairly simply. You just enter a string of text representing either a range name or the cell references of the cells which contain the values you want to select. The small problem with the row source property is it's fairly inflexible. Once the form is running, you can't add new items to the list or delete existing items. You can clear the list entirely and then reset the row source property, but that's a little bit of overkill. So what we're going to do is show you a slightly more flexible way to populate a drop-down list using the list property. So what we're going to do is first of all remove the row source property, the BBFC ratings range name from there, and then we're going to add a bit of code to the form's initialize event to add items to this list. The initialize event of the form is probably the best place to do this. So to get to there, let's just quickly double click on the background of the form, and because I've already used the user form initialize event previously, it takes me directly to that event. We've got some commented out lines of code here that set default values for the film gross and film date text boxes. So I'm actually going to remove those altogether, and then we'll replace some lines of code here to populate our combo box instead. It's probably worthwhile mentioning that you can just set the row source property in code. So if I wanted to, I could say film certificate dot row source equals, and then I can use a string of text. So I can say BBFC ratings, and as soon as the form is loaded, that would automatically set the row source property. But as I said earlier on, you can't then subsequently add new items or remove existing items from the list. So that's not quite what we want to do. Let's comment out that line. Instead, what we're going to do is use the list property. So the list property is subtly different. If I say film certificate dot list equals, what I need to do here is refer to the value property of a range of cells. So I can say range. The simplest thing to do here is use the range name that I created earlier on, which was BBFC ratings, although of course I could use any other range of cells, cell references, and then say dot value. So to the end user to begin with, there will be absolutely no difference in the way this works. If I switch back into Excel quickly, and choose to show my form on screen, I'll get exactly the same list of values that I had last time with the row source property. Now, one of the useful things about the list property is that it allows you to refer to a range of cells relatively, as opposed to the row source property where you have to enter a string of text representing a fixed absolute range of cells. So that can be useful when your list of values which populate your combo boxes changes frequently. So if we imagine, for instance, that the BBFC rating system was going to change regularly, we might have a different number of items in this list each time. So for instance, there is actually another rating for the BBFC. It's called R18, which is for very naughty films, so we won't talk about those. But just adding a new item to the end of the list doesn't incorporate that inside the BBFC ratings range name. So what we'd have to do with the row source property is either change the way the range name works, or we'd have to update the row source property in the form's design. With the list property, however, we can write some simple code that refers to all the values in this list from range A2 down to whichever cell sits at the bottom of the list from range A2. So let's go back to the Visual Basic editor and write some code that will allow us to do that. So back to the initialize event of the form, and we're simply going to change this line which says film certificate.list equals. So let's start by removing the range of cells that refers to the BBFC ratings, and we'll replace that with a relative selection. So we're going to say, we'll refer first of all to the worksheet lists. So we'll say WS lists dot range A2, which is the top cell in our list, followed by a comma, and then to refer to the bottom cell in the list from range A2 downwards, we can say WS lists dot range A2 dot end XL down. Stick a dot value on the end to refer to the values of those cells, and just so we can see this in one single screen width, let me write this across two separate lines. So the top cell that we're referring to in our list is range A2 on the WS lists sheet, and the bottom cell we're referencing in the list is the cell that's at the end of the list in a downwards direction from range A2 on the list sheet. We've dealt with this in so much detail in the Excel VBA tutorial series. There's an entire video all about selecting cells. I think it's part number 5 in that series. So if you're not sure about how this works, feel free to go back and watch that video. But just to prove that it does work, what we can do now is go back into Excel. We display the form on screen from our menu sheet. We can click any of these buttons. We should find that now we've added in this extra rating system based on the values that are already in the list. The great thing is that adapts automatically based on how many items are in the list. So if we added ratings X, Y, and Z, then those would automatically be included the next time we show the form. Likewise, if we remove items from the list, in the list sheet, those would also be removed from the list of ratings when we load the form again. So a nice dynamic, flexible way to set the values in a drop-down list. If for some reason you didn't want to have to store the values for your drop-down list somewhere in a worksheet, you could always write code to add items individually. So heading back to the initialize event of the form, what we're going to do is, actually let's write this in a separate subroutine altogether, just so we can quickly deactivate it later on. I'm going to write a separate private sub that will, let's see, that will add or populate certificates. So let's say populate certificates. And we're going to do this by adding items individually into the certificate list. So to do that, we can simply say film certificate dot add item. And then I can just reference the value that I want to pass in. So let's add in U first of all, and then I can just happily copy and paste that line several times. It might make more sense to use a with statement here actually. So let's have a with statement where we'll say with film certificate dot add item and then end with. And then I can simply copy and paste the add item section just to avoid replicating more code than is absolutely necessary. I can't remember how many I need, so let's find out. So UPG 12A 12 15 and 18. There we go. I've got it right. Super. I'll miss out the last one, the R18. I don't really care about that one. So having done that, rather than setting the list property in the initialize event of the form, I'm just going to comment out those two lines there. What we can do instead is just call on our populate certificates subroutine. So I can say call populate certificates. Again, the call keyword is optional. You don't have to enter that. I'm going to leave it in there. Just I think it makes a nice way to indicate that you're calling a procedure you've written rather than something that exists in VBA already. So having done that, if we switch back into Excel and we have a look at the form, once again it should be populated with the same list of values. So that would mean we could get rid of our lists sheet altogether. We don't need to store those values anywhere in the worksheet anymore. Just for convenience though, I'm going to go back to my VB editor again, and I think it makes more sense for this particular example, back to the VB editor, I think it makes more sense for this particular example to populate the list based on the values of the cells. So I'm going to uncomment those. I'm going to remove the line which calls my populate certificates subroutine and then leave it as so. It's also worth knowing that you can update the list of entries in a drop-down list when the form is actually running. So what I've done here is I've come back to the lists sheet and I've added in the MPAA ratings. So these are the American rating systems for movies. So I've entered these values into cells and I've given this block of cells a range name. And what I'd like to be able to do is switch between these two rating systems when the form is actually running. So heading back to the Visual Basic editor, I'm going to do this in a fairly simple way to begin with actually. I'm going to add a couple of simple buttons inside the frame that let me click between the UK and the US rating system. So let me just move these, in fact let me just increase the size of my form first of all, move these buttons down a little bit further and then increase the height of my frame, and I'm going to add in a couple of simple little buttons, command buttons again, tools we're familiar with already, and then I'm going to add in a similar one. That's a similar sort of size. I don't care too much about the formatting here. What I will do is change the name and the caption of these buttons. So let's change the name of the first one so that it says use UK ratings. And then for the second one, that'll say use US ratings. And then the caption of this will be US, nice and simple, and the caption of this one will be UK. The click event of these two buttons, very, very simply, all we're going to do is update. Well, first of all, we're going to clear the contents of the existing list first using the clear method, and then we're going to reset the list property to use a different range of cells. So let's start with the UK rating system. First of all, I'm going to double click on that button to give me the click event of that button, and then we're going to write a couple of simple lines of code in here to reset the values in the list. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is clear the contents of the original list, and we can do that really, really simply by saying film certificates dot clear. Genuinely as simple as that. The clear method will clear all the contents of the original list, plus any items that you've currently got selected as well. And in fact, just to prove that, let's switch back to Excel briefly and let's launch the dialog box. And if I select an item from the list at this point and then click my UK button, it will delete the value that I've selected, but also clear all the existing items in the list. So it's worthwhile knowing that you can do that just independently by itself. Anyway, you can clear your list at any time by applying the clear method. Let's close the form down, and then we will go back to the VB editor and continue with the code behind this button. So the next thing I'm going to do is make sure that the film certificate list is set to be equal to the UK ratings, the BBFC ratings. Rather than using the same technique I used earlier on, in fact, let's just do this. I can quickly click and drag to copy and paste this same code and just drop it straight in there. Okay, so now that will reset the rating system for the UK ratings, the BBFC. And what I'm going to do while I'm here is select the Use US Ratings button object from the drop-down list at the top left, and that will generate the click event for that button. I'm going to say film certificates or film certificate.clear, and then we'll reset the film certificate list to be equal to the range of cells containing the MPAA rating system. So .list equals, rather than using the same relative selection technique, I'm just going to refer to the range name just to make things slightly easier. I'm going to refer to range MPAA ratings .value. Okay, so having done that, switching back into Excel, I should be able to launch my form. And then I'll currently have the UK ratings. That was the default entry that was selected. If I click the US system, it'll switch, so now I can choose US ratings instead. If I click UK, it'll go back to the UK ratings, and so on and so on and so on. So nice, quick and simple idea that you can switch the values in your drop-down list using events of the form while the form is running. Okay, so the last set of ideas to talk about with combo boxes is the idea of multi-column combo boxes. So what I've done is I've added in an extra column into the main list that describes who the film is suitable for. And in the lists worksheet, I've also added in a description column next to each rating. It's a rough description of who the film is suitable for. So what that age rating is meant to imply. It's not 100% accurate. It's just for demonstration purposes. So don't read too much into this. What I need to do, or what I'm going to do, is just quickly update the range names as well to make sure that they refer to a range of cells with multiple columns. This is just to make my life easier when I'm starting to write code inside the form. So to modify the definition of a range name, you can head to the Formulas tab in the ribbon and choose the Name Manager. And then in there you'll see a list of all the range names you've created for the workbook. If I select the BBFC ratings one, I can choose to edit that, and a couple of ways I can do it. Simplest is to click the cell selector button and just reselect the cells like so. So that's the one for the BBFC ratings. I'll do the same for the MPAA ratings as well. So I'll choose to edit that and then use the range selector to select that block of cells. Okay, so those are the two range names updated. What we're going to do now is head back into the VB editor, and we're going to update our drop-down list, our combo box, so it can accept multiple columns. So the first thing I'm going to do here is choose what range of cells the drop-down list is populated with when the form first loads. So that involves going to the initialize event of the form. So if I can go to the code view of the form, and then I'm going to update the line which refers to what range of cells the list is populated with to begin with. I can do this in a relative, using a relative cell selection technique. So going from cell A2 down to the end of the list downwards, I could then simply extend that and say .end XL to right as well. And then that will refer to the values of all the cells from A to end downwards and to the right. So that's the equivalent of if you were in Excel. going from cell A2, holding down Control and Shift and tapping the down arrow key and then the right arrow key. So it'd be that block of cells. It's a bit of overkill, slightly unnecessary for this. I'm going to assume we've got a fairly fixed list at this point. So what I'm going to do instead of doing that is just refer to the BBFC ratings range. I'm going to comment out those two lines and replace that with film certificate dot list equals range BBFC ratings dot value. I'm going to copy and paste that line as well, so I'm going to update our two buttons as well. So I'm going to copy that and paste it into the Use UK Ratings subroutine, and then comment out the two lines that use the relative cell selection techniques again. And then a similar sort of thing. In fact, I don't need to change anything about the US ratings because that uses the MPWA ratings range name already. So, having done that, what I'm going to do now is go back to Excel, and I'm going to show the form on screen by clicking one of my buttons on my menu sheet. And although I have selected multiple columns for the range which populates the drop-down list, I'm not actually going to see any extra values here. The reason for that is because I haven't finished changing all the properties necessary to make a ComboBox display multiple values. So I'm going to close the form down, head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then select the ComboBox and look at these other properties. It makes it slightly easier to find all these properties by switching the properties list into Categorize view, and then you can scroll down through the list and find the Data category. So the reason we're only seeing one column's worth of data in our drop-down list is because the column count property is still set to 1. So let's simply update that to the number 2, and then we can click on the background of the form and choose to run it, and we'll suddenly see now that in the ComboBox we can see 2 columns of data. So it probably makes a bit more sense maybe to make the ComboBox a bit wider at this point. We can also modify the widths of the columns in the properties window too. So let's close the form down, and then I'm just going to make the actual form itself a little bit wider. So let's change the form and then increase the width of the frame. Then I want to increase the width of all these objects all at the same time. So let's just change all their widths. But I can also, as well as changing the actual physical width of the entire control, I can change the individual column widths within the ComboBox. So with the ComboBox selected, again going back to the Properties window and back to the Data column, I've got the column widths property. Now the default units for the widths of the columns in a ComboBox are in points. So if I just entered a number here, like say 24, followed by a semicolon to move on to the next column, and enter 24 again, when I press enter, those units will be entered as points. If I wanted centimetres instead, so let's say maybe, I know 1.5 cm, semicolon, 1.5 cm. When I hit enter, those will be converted into the equivalent distance in points. If I wanted to use inches, I'd use IN instead. I'm actually going to reset those back to 24 and 24 and then see what effect that has when I run the form. So if I click on the background of the form and then run it, I'll see the column width has now been set to the distance I've just selected. So yeah, not too bad, it kind of works. I could probably do with making the ComboBox a bit wider again, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. So that's how you set the column widths of the ComboBox. The next thing to look at is how to refer to the values of multiple columns in a ComboBox. So we already have some code that's referring to the value of the ComboBox that we added in earlier on. If I double click the Add to List button and then right click Add Data to List and choose Definition, sitting right here is a line of code that refers to the value of the film certificate ComboBox. So that will still work currently. If I go back to Excel and then just added in some random data, just some sample data, it doesn't really matter what I type in here, just some text, a number, a date, and then choose a certificate from the list, doesn't really matter which one. When I click my Add to List button, we'll see that it returns the value of the first column. The reason this happens is due to a property called the bound column. If I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor and select the ComboBox and scroll down to the Data category again, the bound column property is set to the number 1. So this refers to the first column from left to right and specifies that it's the first column's value that gets entered into the value property of the control. Now if I want to refer to the value of another column in the ComboBox, I've got a couple of different choices here. One choice would be to use the text column property. If I set that to the number 2, that means that the text property of my ComboBox now will refer to the value of the second column in the ComboBox. So what that means is I've now got a distinction, a difference between the text property and the value property for the ComboBox. Previously, those always return the same value. So if I go back to my Add to List button and then go back to my Add Data to List procedure, What I could do here is say @cell.offset 0,3.value. In fact, let me just copy and paste this just for simplicity. I can say here now film certificate dot text rather than dot value. So because I've set the text column property to be equal to 2, that will return the value from the second column of the combo box. I'm going to update this so I refer to the value of the cell that's offset 4 columns to the right now to avoid overwriting the certificate. And one more quick little test. Back into Excel, I can then display the form on screen and type in some random numbers and values, doesn't really matter what, as long as they're valid numbers and dates, and then select an item from the drop-down list. So if I click my Add to List button now, I will find indeed that I've got both the certificate and the description entered into the list. Now, although changing the text column property does have the desired effect in allowing us to refer to the value of a second column, it does have a couple of slightly odd side effects, one of which you may have noticed in the previous section. If I just go back to Excel and I choose to show my form on screen and then select an item from the drop-down list, 12A Kids with Adults, what will happen when I select this option is it doesn't show me the name of the certificate anymore, it shows me the description of the certificate. So it shows me the value of the text column. That's one small issue, not a major problem, we could live with that. The other slightly weird thing that happens though is that the validation code doesn't quite work anymore. If I show the form again and I try to add to the list without selecting an item, you'll see that the validation code doesn't seem to be triggered. Earlier on we added in a statement that said if the value of the combo box was equal to an empty string. But when you've changed the text column property, the value returned by an empty combo box isn't an empty string anymore, it actually returns the value null, or the non-value null, and that makes more sense. So what I'd have to do is change my validation code to check for nulls in the combo box, or I could check the text property for an empty string rather than the value property. So these changes are all surmountable, but it probably makes more sense in this example, to reset the text column property back to its original setting, so that what we can do then is use a different method to refer to the values of different columns in the combo box. So back in the Visual Basic Editor, I'm just going to select the combo box and change the text column property back to -1. That setting, by the way, makes the text column refer to the value of the first column that does not have a 0 width. That's the technical description anyway. So just going back to Excel, this means that the validation code will now still work. If I click Add to List without selecting anything, the validation code is triggered again. And if I do select an item from the list, it will select the or will display the value column, so the certificate name rather than the description. The other issue we would have had with our text column property is it still only allows us to access one extra column in the combo box. So in this case our column count is 2, so that would have worked. But if our column count was more than that, then the text column property doesn't really help. So if you want to refer to any numbered column in the entire combo box, no matter how many columns you've got, there's another property that you can use, and that property is called column. So we're going to go back to the code behind the Add to List button, and then I'm going to view the definition of my Add Data to List procedure. And then I'll scroll down a little bit, and what we're going to do here is we're going to update the section of code where we're referencing the value and the text of the film certificate. So let's start by removing the value property and replacing that with a reference to the column property instead. Now the column property allows you to specify both the column index and the row index of the value you want to retrieve. If I open a set of parentheses, the first thing I have to do is specify the number of the column whose value I want to get. Now, with the bound column and the text column properties, the columns are indexed from a base of 1. So the first column is index number 1, second column is number 2. With the column property, that's slightly different. The column property uses a base of 0. So the first column is indexed as 0, and the second column is indexed as 1, and so on. Slightly confusing, I know, but that's just the way that it is, so you have to sadly accept it. I can also optionally reference the row number of the item I want to retrieve. Now by default, if I don't do that, what will happen is that the column property returns the value from the specified column on the selected row. So if I select, for instance, the PG row in the drop-down list, it will use the row, the details of the row for the PG films, or the PG certificate, sorry. If I wanted to, I could specify the row index that I want to retrieve, but to refer to the selected item is a little bit fiddly. What I have to do is refer to the combo box itself first of all, and then refer to the list index property. So the list index property refers to the index number of the row of the selected item in the combo box. It's a bit of a mouthful, but as I say, it's not actually necessary to do either. You might well prefer in the real world just to omit that and just say column 0 to retrieve the value of the first column. I'm going to leave it in there as I've made the effort to type it in, just for reference. And again, we can then replace the text property from the row a bit further down. Again, we can remove the text property altogether and replace that with the reference to the column property. And again, this time we're referring to column number 1, so the second column, confusingly. And again, if I wanted to, I could refer to film certificate dot list index to refer to the selected item or the selected row. Again, that's not necessary. That's entirely your choice. So, having done all of that, let's head back to Excel, give this one final test by showing the form on screen, typing in some random text, doesn't really matter. Again, the number I don't care about, and the release date just needs to be some kind of valid date. And then the certificate, let's select, well, let's choose one we haven't chosen before, let's choose number 18, grown-ups. And then if I click my add to list button, I will find indeed that I get the 18 certificate and grown-ups added in. So there we go. That's pretty much everything there is to know about combo boxes for the time being. The next video is going to talk about a slightly different form of list. We're going to talk about list boxes. Very, very similar to the way combo boxes work. The main advantage of a list box is that it allows you to select multiple items, whereas with a combo box you can only select one. So hopefully you'll join us for that one, and we'll see you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.